And coming live from a undisclosed area, projected possibly to return back to studio next month. We'll see how that goes. This has been a multi-monthly trial basis to see how this works. One of the reasons we have done the remote broadcast is because at one point in time we were attempting to secure a interview in San Juan and via invitation to broadcast from a hotel, a beachside hotel, at that location. Anyway, so now that remote broadcasting is confirmed, we are set to go. Solid connection here. This is Discussions of Truth. I'm your host, Ian Hamilton Trottier. Follow me on Twitter. Follow me on Instagram. And on my website, that is iantrottier.com, you will find a list of excellent links. These are all accessible, free PDF links. I've got a number of Anthony Sutton publications. He's a former Stanford Hoover Fellow. The best enemy money can buy is one of his publications. Federal Reserve Conspiracy, America's Secret Establishment, Two Faces of George Bush. So we've got a number of Anthony Sutton publications, but also some Eustace Mullins publications there, Edward Mandell House publications, a report on Club of Rome. The list goes on. It's very fairly extensive and should be quite entertaining and educational for those who browse. Again, they are all free, accessibly via PDF. But those are again listed on the website. Just go to the Articles tab. The Lindstrath Report. We usually run a Lindstrath Report the first Wednesday of the month. That report for this month has been pushed back and will be rescheduled. Likely we'll be doing a double header with JP to get you a Lindstrath Report. JP is a former Fulbright scholar to Brazil from Oxford. Okay, coming up March 25th, we will be hosting A. Ralph Epperson. That's initial A, name Ralph Epperson. El Nuevo Orden Mundial is one of his publications. That's coming up in March 11th, March 25th for Ralph. William Alva Blunden, a Cornell-educated San Francisco State University-based lecturer. He'll be talking about Behold a Pale Farce and Rootkit Arsenal. That'll be March 11th. Bandy Lee will be joining program February 19th. She is currently part of the Yale faculty. Her book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess Donald Trump. Okay, that is the book that she spearheaded. She'll be joining us February 19th. Kevin Annett, Murder by Decree, the Crime of Genocide in the Country of Canada. We'll be joining program February 12th. And starting off next month, the 5th of February, we'll be hosting here on Discuss Your Truth, Russ Baker. Russell Warren Baker. Bill Moores had this to say about Baker. He seemed unimpressed with conventional wisdom, quickly spotted and dismissed spin, and wasn't intimidated by the powers that be. It has been said on program by former CIA operative that what is happening here in the podcast realm, in independent radio, online radio realm, is the new frontier, really, for receiving truth, because what you're getting in mainstream media is totally hogwash. It's all saturated with bias and big corporate maneuvers. So that's Ray McGovern who said that right here on this program. Josh Reeves will be ending this month. That's January 29th, the Global Reality Show. And next week we'll be hosting Partners in Crime, the Rockefeller, CFR, CIA, and Castro connection to the Kennedy assassination. That's Servando Gonzalez. Today, the New Yorker magazine is quoted as calling him the most important thinker on intellectual property in the internet era. We'll be dialing in very shortly former U.S. presidential candidate among the Democrat Party in 2016, Lawrence Lessig III. He's an attorney, university lecturer, and political activist. He holds the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard University. Okay, and he again will be joining us to speak about what he's doing, his books, and his writings. Republic Lost is he'll be going into this one of his books. Okay, and if you didn't catch last week's episode, a doubleheader, British scholar Tobias Churton had to reschedule, but we had a 2-hour program with Jordan Maxwell. And you can find that program. It's been uploaded into Anchor.fm, where it goes out to iTunes and Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other platforms such as Google Play. And you can also find the episode with Jordan up on YouTube. The New World Order is his interpretation thereof is what Jordan addressed. So that is your slate coming up for the next few weeks, and we are now going to dial in Lawrence Lessig into program. Again, this is Discussions of Truth. I'm your host weekly, Wednesdays, 5 p.m. Ian Hamilton Trottier is my name, and we are now in our 4th year of Discussions of Truth. We just completed this month, completed our 3rd year of Discussions of Truth. You can find all previous guests on my website. That's IENTROTTIER.com. And coming up in April, from Trine Day Publishing, you will find my book that you can pre-order now, Freedom Reserved, No More Lies. That is available on pre-order currently. Okay, so let's dial in. I've got confirmation dialing in Lawrence Lessig.
Hello.
Lawrence Lessig, this is Ian Trottier, Discussions of Truth, Wynwood Radio, Miami.
Great to speak to you.
Great to speak with you, and appreciate your time. For listeners out there, and I hope you're enjoying a nice 2020, the preliminary stages of 2020. That's for you, Lawrence. Wishing you a happy new year. For listeners who are not familiar with you and what you do, Lawrence, would you please take a moment to introduce yourself? You currently lecture at Harvard. Is that correct?
That's right. So hard for me to believe that there's somebody out there who doesn't know who I am, but just for that one person or two people. So I'm a law professor at Harvard. I've been, for the last 12 years, focused on the question of how we decorrupt our corrupted democracy. And I've just published a book called They Don't Represent Us, which is my latest effort to frame the problem and to describe a solution.
So that's music to my ears, and that's what we addressed frequently on this program. We constantly talk about non-mainstream news issues, stuff that just gets totally covered up, that doesn't come forth. We address ties to the CFR and different publications like Time Magazine or CBS. But this is really music to my ears to repeat that they don't represent us, because it's becoming pretty mainstream now, to reuse that term, that that we have a government that is completely bought out by super PACs. The voting system is of major concern, the validity thereof. Even 20 years ago with the hanging chads in Florida, that was a major issue. But what we're finding is this military-industrial complex completely manipulating the way that a democracy perhaps arguably may have once been run. And again, that's arguable. We the people, what does that really mean? Did it ever represent we the people? It certainly didn't represent people like who became Martin Luther King. So that's and it's a whole other argument in a nutshell. We could go in that direction. But per your opinion, Lawrence, what really is happening in the United States today?
Well, if you look at our system of, quote, representative democracy, which is what the framers thought that they were giving us, it's certainly clear that from our perspective, looking backwards, it's never really represented us. Although from their perspective, given the people they thought mattered, it was better than it is today. I mean, today we have any number of dimensions of inequality built into our representative democracy. So the most grotesque, extreme example is the way we fund campaigns. You know, members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to fund their campaigns. And obviously, as they do that, they become sensitive to, like in the way Foucault would say, they become disciplined by the interests of their funders. But the funders are not the average American. The funders are no more than 150,000 Americans who are the people they are calling in order to fund their campaigns. So this means those 150,000 Americans are radically more important than the rest of America in creating our representative democracy, because they need their money first before they have a chance to run and get our votes. So that's one example. The second example is gerrymandering. You know, we craft the House of Representatives so that most of the seats are safe seats. There's probably no more than 60 competitive seats in the House of Representatives. But what a safe seat means is that the representative is obsessively focused on what the extreme members of his or her party care about. Because the only person that can beat you in a safe seat Republican district is a more conservative, say, Republican, or in a safe seat Democratic district, and even more progressive Democrat. So the point is, they become extremely sensitive to the extremes, which means they're ignoring the mainstream or the other side of their representative system or their district. Or, you know, another, just one final obvious example, the Electoral College. I mean, you know, so you're calling from Florida. Florida is one of those 14 states that gets to pick the president of the United States. The rest of us, the people who don't live in the so-called swing states, we don't matter. We don't matter because no candidate cares at all how we vote, because they don't spend a penny trying to persuade us how to vote one way or the other. In 2016, 99% of campaign spending was in the so-called swing states, which means the rest of America, the majority of America, just didn't matter to those candidates. But the problem is the swing states don't represent America, you know, as Florida will evince. You guys are older, you're whiter, or at least not Florida, but the rest of the swing states are whiter than average America, which means that the president is obsessed with pleasing a segment of America that does not represent America. So this is another example of how they just don't represent us.
So how do you feel? What is? Let's go back to the money issue, because even Kamala Harris has dropped out of this race, and even going back to the previous race, a guy like who I was really impressed with, Ben Carson, who just seems brilliant, very well educated, surgeon, and he couldn't keep up with the big money. So I think we've got the intelligence and capability out there, it seems, from a layman's terms across the board in the United States. We've got so many worthy candidates, but they just simply cannot rise above and get that funding. So in your view, and of course, for listeners who may not be familiar, you were actually a candidate in 2016. In your view and experience, how does that get fixed?
Well, I think it's really important to realize the problem of funding presidential campaigns is radically different from the problem of funding congressional campaigns. And the more important problem to solve is the problem of congressional campaigns. Because right now, Congress is bought. It is completely controlled and controllable by a tiny number of funders, because members of Congress know that if they get on the wrong side of these super PACs or these funders, they will be taken out. And so they have to hew to the party line, whether it's Republican or Democratic party line, to keep in line with those funders. Presidential campaigns sometimes can be different. So the rich, like Bloomberg or Steyer, can fund their campaigns, or Donald Trump said he funded his campaign independently. Turned out that wasn't true. But they can fund their campaigns without relying on anyone. The famous, like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, can fund their campaigns by raising money from millions of individual contributors. Bernie Sanders' average contribution is something like $18 right now. And he has raised 5 million. He's gotten 5 million people to give him contributions. That's unprecedented in American history. But the other people running in those races, the not rich nor famous, if they want to compete, they've either got to take big money, like Pete Buttigieg discovers he needs to, or they need to try to fund their campaign with public funding, which turns out is woefully inadequate. So I think we should also solve the problem of funding presidential campaigns to make it easier for people to compete in presidential elections without bending over backwards to big money. But the more important problem to solve, the one we have to solve if we're going to get climate change legislation or healthcare legislation or any of the other important things we've got to do, is fixing the way Congress funds its campaigns, and that means through some version of public funding.
Do we chip away a little bit at this if we come up with term limits?
If you don't change the way you fund campaigns, it doesn't matter whether term limits exists or not, because the people running for Congress are going to go to the same people to fund their campaign. So somebody who's been in Congress for 30 years may depend less on these big funders than somebody who's coming in to compete against that person or compete after just being in Congress for 1 or 2 years. So I'm not against the idea of reasonable term limits. You can't look at the United States Senate, especially when they're interrogating somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, and not think that these people are way, way, way over the hill and should not be in the United States Senate because they know nothing about the modern questions of especially technology. But so I'm not against term limits. It's just term limits alone are not going to solve the problem. You've got to change the dependence that these candidates have on the big money. And the only way to do that for 99% of those candidates is to create a system of publicly funded elections.
And where in the history of campaign management, or how campaigns were run in the history of the country, where did this start to become an issue in your view? At what point in time in the history of the Republic?
Newt Gingrich broke Congress. It's just that simple. In 1995, when Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House, he radically changed the norms of Congress. He told members of Congress they're only going to work 3 days a week, not like the rest of us who work at least 5, most of us 6, some of us 7. Only have to work 3 days a week. The rest of the time, he sold by saying you can go home to your district. But what in reality happened is that they went out to raise money. So they spend, since 1995, 30 to 70% of their time raising money. And that life of, low-paid fundraisers radically changes the capacity of Congress, first of all, to understand the issues they're supposed to be voting on, but more importantly, to have independence to vote in a way that would actually produce a result that America cared about. I mean, what they're doing is voting in a way that makes sure the funders of campaigns are happy, but the funders of campaigns, it turns out, are not the average American. So it broke starting in 1935, and it is unrecognizable today compared to the way it was even in like 1990.
So Now, I think it may have been a Joe Rogan experience or podcast I listened to that you had mentioned that you have a family member. I think it was your mother lives in Hilton Head, a location that I'm familiar with, South Carolina, and a local politician had just like recently been elected and was immediately starting to raise money on the next election. Do we somehow try to pass a law and say, hey, wait a second, you got to focus on your term and no, you can't start collecting money for down the road? That doesn't make sense. Is that something that a road we could possibly pursue?
Yeah. So Joe Cunningham, as a Democrat, it was the first time a Democrat has won that district in forever. He was an incredibly effective candidate, and he's effective at raising money. And he took that skill and after he was elected, turned it into raising more money. And it's obvious why he did that, because it's a district that the Republicans are going to fight like hell in 2020 to reclaim. And so it was important for him to build the war chest necessary for him to withstand the Republican onslaught. But look, no, I don't think we should be solving the problem of money by just learning to say no more effectively. First of all, the Supreme Court would never allow a law to be passed that said you can't raise money. Supreme Court has made that pretty clear. But secondly, I think we've been trying to reform Congress on the cheap for way too long. We've been trying to fix the problem of money in politics by talking about all the places where the law will say no. So we tried to say no to soft money. We tried to say no to super PAC money. We tried to say no to all these places where money was bleeding in, and Congress said it didn't like the effect of that money. And I don't like the effect of that money either, but the Supreme Court has made it clear you can't simply say no. What you can do, and the Supreme Court has said this again and again, is you can publicly fund these campaigns. You can make it easy for people to raise money without depending on big money to fund their campaigns. And the best way to publicly fund campaigns is to do something which Andrew Yang has talked about, now even Bernie Sanders is talking about, basically giving every voter what we could call a democracy voucher, basically taking the first $50 or $100 or $200 of taxes, which they send to the federal government, and absolutely every American sends that amount of money to the federal government, regardless of the source of the taxes, and send it back to them in the form of a voucher and say, you can use these $100, $200 to help people fund their campaigns. And if you did that, then what Joe Cunningham in Hilton Head would be doing is not calling up the relatively rich. He thought my mom was rich, but only because she gave him a significant amount of money before she passed away. But they'd be raising money from average people, ordinary people. They'd be going to neighborhoods, even poor neighborhoods, and they'd be saying to people, here's what I will do for you. Here's why you should elect me as your congressperson. And if that's compelling, then people in those neighborhoods would start giving those candidates that money. And so they would be dependent, of course, on their funders, but their funders would be the people. That's what a democracy is supposed to be. Right now, they are dependent on their funders, and the funders are not the people. They are indirectly the corporations, or they're the super rich. You know, the lesson that we've known since the beginning of nursery rhymes is he who pays the piper calls the tune. And if it's the 150,000 who are funding campaigns right now, they're calling the tune. But if we were funding the campaigns, we would be calling the tune, and that means they would be responsive to us.
Strength in numbers. So, Lawrence, let's go into to voter fraud. How do we? What's the new frontier in submitting a vote in the country? How do you see that?
Well, look, obviously, in theory, we should be worried about voting fraud. But the reality is there's just no significant problem of voting fraud. There's been study after study that has tried to demonstrate that there are people who are actually out there trying to vote in more than one place at one election. And they just can't find it. Now, every once in a while, they'll find somebody. It turns out most of the people found in 2018 were Republicans trying to vote in more than one place. But you'll find somebody who doesn't realize that they're not supposed to vote in this district or that district. There was a really unfortunate woman in Texas who, African-American woman, who was on probation and didn't know that means she couldn't vote. So she went to vote and she was convicted for voting fraud, because you're not allowed to vote if you're on probation, sentenced to 5 years in jail. 5 years in jail.
Oh my goodness.
You know, the people who caused the financial crisis that threw how many millions of Americans out of their home, they didn't serve 1 day in jail. But this woman who just tried to vote was sentenced to 5 years in jail.
Yeah.
I mean, so I get the theoretical problem, but I'm an academic. Even an academic like me can realize that theory is one thing and reality is something different. The reality is these schemes designed to eliminate so-called voting fraud are actually schemes designed to make it difficult for some people to vote. And who are those people? They are the people from a party not represented by the party in power in that state. So in the state of Georgia, the Republican Party deployed many techniques, throwing people off the voting rolls, matching names to say that they were trying to commit voting fraud, shutting down polling places, reducing the times of polling places, reducing the times you could vote before the election day. All of that was intended for one purpose only, to make it harder for Democrats to vote. Now, turns out most of the Democrats that were affected by that were also African American. So many African Americans look at that and say, the intent here was to make it harder for blacks to vote. And I don't have a problem with describing it like that. But the reality is what they're motivated by is the desire to make sure the other party can't win. They're tilting the playing field against the outsider. And that is just deeply un-American. We should not have a voting system where the people running the system are allowed to run it so that their opponents find it harder to vote. Yet that's the reality we have right now. And it's justified with all this, excuse the term, it's a technical legal term, bullshit around the idea of voting fraud.
So your book is They Don't Represent Us, and you've written a number of books, and I also want to get into neutrality because you did something interesting at Stanford by developing the Center of Internet and Society. And so the Internet has really kind of transformed the way we live our life and the way we receive and our information and communicate that information and even make purchases and whatnot. So radically in the past 20 years. But sticking for the moment with They Don't Represent Us, Lawrence, who are they?
Yeah, well, the book actually talks about two different theys. So the one they that everybody would immediately imagine I'm talking about is they as in the government. And that's chapter 1 and chapter 3. They don't represent us in the sense that the government doesn't represent us for all the reasons we've just been talking about. Money in politics, gerrymandering, the Electoral College, the Senate, the suppression of votes. Those are all the dimensions of inequality, unrepresentativeness built into our democracy. But the second part of the book, chapters 2 and chapter 4, talk about what I think is a much harder problem. I think we don't represent us. Uh-huh. You know, the way in which we get represented in the political process, you know, through public opinion polls, call us up as we're preparing for dinner, ask us, what do you think of thorium reactors? Or should we ratify NAFTA again? Or all these questions that get thrown at people when they're trying to do other things. We get represented by those polls. But those polls are ridiculous because we today live in a media environment where 40% of us are focused on the Fox News world and 40% of us are focused on the MSNBC world. And the facts that we believe are true are very different depending on which world you happen to occupy. And so we are divided and polarized and have no chance to even understand the issues that we are being asked about. So that when we get rendered in these polls, we get rendered as ridiculous, as ignorant, as people that don't know anything. And it reinforces the position of anti-democrats who want to say, look, the people are idiots. Why should we set a government up to follow what the people do? Let's set up technocrats or academics or, you know, law professors to run our government. And my view is that anti-democratic movement is winning because we get represented in such a stupidly idiotic way. And instead of us being represented like that, we're never going to silence polls and we're never going to stop, you know, people from expressing themselves. That's not what I'm talking about. What instead we need to do is to begin to build other ways that we, the people, can be represented, ways that make it so that there's a representative number of us who are diverse and reflect, you know, the average actual population, who are given information, given a chance to reflect on the question, and then given a chance to give their views after that reflection. And that way of representing us, which is through processes like what's called deliberative polling or other ways of inducing mini publics to speak for the people, would produce a view of us that I think is a fairer representation of us than the way we get represented right now. And I think that's just as important a problem, maybe even a harder problem, than the problem of solving the government. Because I could tell you right now the 5 things to do to fix the problem of they don't represent us, as in the government doesn't represent us. But it's a really hard problem, given cable news and social media, to think about how we produce a public of we that actually properly can be said to represent us.
Right. So I think it was maybe yesterday that Facebook had come out and suggested that they did swayed voters in a way that tilted the platter towards Trump in that last election. How does social media move forward in this regard to level it? Can it possibly level the playing field? Is that a question that makes sense to you?
Not anymore. Although in my naive days, my early days when I was working on the internet, many of us were really optimistic. The internet was a great leveler. Like, all we had to do to solve the problem of ignorance in America is to give people access to more information. Well, we did that. And it turned out the polarization and the fragmented media has now produced a different kind of ignorance. And, it's just as bad, maybe even worse. Look, I think the key thing is to recognize that all of this is driven by the commercial business model of both cable news and social media. I mean, start with cable news. In 1995, when Roger Ailes started Fox News, the original vision of Fox News was going to be like every other news show. It was going to try to appeal to all of America. And early on, Roger Ailes said, hell no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to focus on the conservative base of America. We're going to turn out our base. We're going to develop a message that appeals to them. We don't care about the liberals. Let the rest of the media fight over the liberals. We're going to focus on the base. And that business model was shocking when it was announced. Even in Fox News, people in Fox News couldn't believe that they were going to do that. But they did it, and they proved that it was the most profitable business model for cable news. And then everybody else followed them. So MSNBC is now just the opposite. I mean, they're not. I mean, because I'm a liberal, I'm not gonna say that they're as bad. Of course, they're not as bad. I think that they're more fact-based than much of what goes on in the Tucker Carlson world of Fox News. But still, the point they realized is the same point that Roger Ailes realized. They need to identify a base and turn them out. That is their business model now. That's how they sell the most ads. And that's the same thing in Facebook. Facebook realized early on that if they sell ads to a passionate, activated, motivated partisan base, people playing the politics of hate, they're going to get more attention, more activity, more turnover, more money for the people who are buying the ads. So that's what they build it for. They build the platform to enable the ads to be sold the best. Now, the question is, building a platform to sell ads, does that build a platform to advance democracy? And I think what we're seeing is the answer to that question is absolutely no. I mean, it's good for Facebook, but what's good for Facebook is not good for America or good for democracy. And I think the real challenge we have is, what do we do now that this massive system of social media has a business model that is contrary to the business model of democracy? Who's supposed to win, the business model of social media or democracy?
Right. And speaking of the media and how Fox is totally to the right and then MSNBC is totally to the left, is that greed driven? Is that what that is? Because it seems like fair and balanced, which is what Fox claims to be. They're completely unfair and balanced. But that's not when Americans want to turn on a news source. That's objectively what they want to get, is just the reporting. Now it's the statistics are swayed in one way or the other. Is that driven by greed? Is that all that is no longer a desire to give the American public the facts, but to give them what they're going to eat up?
Well, I wish I could believe that the American public really just wanted the facts. Because if that's what the American public wanted, we would see in prime time people like the modern version of, Walter Cronkite. But we don't. we see in the modern prime time, very smart proponents of one side and the other. And it's not like Fox News or MSNBC is stupid about this. I'm sure they do the research. I'm sure they try to see what their audience wants. And if the audience wanted somebody who was kind of down the road, middle of the road, telling it as it is, you'd see it in prime time, but you don't. What you see in prime time are basically opinion news shows. And they're opinion news shows to make the audience comfortable. So people watch Fox News in prime time. They see Tucker Carlson. They want to be comforted. They want their worldview affirmed by Tucker Carlson. What's great about Tucker is he does that most of the time, but he keeps it interesting. Every once in a while he blows it up a little bit. So the president launches a missile strike that takes out a general, one of the leading government officials in Iran, really one of the most astonishing acts, war crimes, I think, in the history of the United States. And all of Fox lines up behind him, except Tucker Carlson. Now, I actually think Tucker Carlson, in his heart of heart, hates the war mentality that has defined neoliberalism for the past, 50 years. But the point is, he says what he says, and it becomes a little bit of a fight on Fox News, and it makes it more interesting to watch Fox News. So it's not like it's against the interest of Fox News to have some division between Tucker and the rest of Fox News. But the point is, the dominant view is very quickly to reinforce people's desire who watch Fox News to like Donald Trump, because those people like Donald Trump. So they want to be convinced Donald Trump is not a crazy man for assassinating a leader of another government. And so most of the people on Fox News reassure them of that. And this is, you don't have to be kind of, I think too often we're kind of judgmental about it in a way that's not fair. I've got on my phone an app called Read Across. And what Read Across does is it watches what I read, and then it figures out what I should be reading in order to give me a balanced view of the news. When I use that app, I hate it. I don't want to be forced to read this stuff I know is ridiculous, like being fed Fox News stories midway through my stories from the New York Times. I know what I want to read, and I don't like to be told what I ought to be reading by my app. And so I get it. I get why people enjoy living in their little bubbles and being confirmed in their little bubbles by the people who are talking to them. That is the reality, and that is the problem. When we have a democracy filled with all of us living in our bubbles, but we've got to deal with problems in common, like, should we impeach the president? What does the democracy do when the people don't even see a common set of facts?
Lawrence, what is the biggest takeaway, the thing that you learned from your run at the Oval Office?
Well, so let's be clear about what happened. In 2015, I was convinced that the Democratic Party needed to make fundamental reform of our political system the central issue in their campaign. They needed to say, fix democracy first or drain the swamp, whatever way you want to put it. The point is, I believed, and the data supported this, that most Americans, like more than 85% of Americans, were deeply angry at the corruption of our government, and the Democratic Party should put it in the center of the stage. I tried to recruit candidates to do that. They refused. I was, working for Bernie at the time. I tried to get Bernie to do it. He said he didn't think it should be the primary issue. He thought healthcare should be the primary issue or whatever. So what I said is, look, I think the evidence we had at the time was I could actually run. And if I ran, I would at least be able to be on the Democratic stage in those debates. And if I was on stage in the debates, I could drive the conversation in a way that forced those candidates to take on this issue of fundamental reform. And whether or not all that happened was that I was on the debate stage, that alone would be reason enough to try. So the Democrats announced the rules for what would qualify you to be on the debate stage. In those days, it wasn't how many contributors you got. It was just according to these so-called polling numbers from independent organizations. Based on the numbers, we thought I could qualify. Originally, we were kind of surprised because the pollsters were not including my name, so I couldn't qualify under the polling rules because my name was not being included in the polls. Bloomberg News wrote an op-ed about how ridiculous that was because they knew from their own data that if my name were in the polls, then I would qualify. But coming up to the second debate, I was getting the numbers. I was going to qualify for the second debate. And just before the second debate, the Democratic Party basically told me that they were changing the rules, that the rules were going to be changed so that I wouldn't qualify. And when they told me they were going to be changing the rules so that I would not qualify for the debates, there was no reason for me to continue to run. So, I was a little astonished. We never expected that they would change the rules midway through the game in order to make sure that I was not on stage. The conspiracy theorists were pretty convinced that they were doing that because they wanted to make sure that nobody on stage was talking about money and politics. But look, in 2020, this election cycle, we have at least 9 candidates running in the Democratic Party and 1 in the Republican Party who has said that they are going to enact fundamental reform of the democratic process as the first thing that they did. So the thing I tried to run on in 2016 is now embraced by the majority, the vast majority of the Democratic ticket, and at least Bill Weld on the Republican ticket. So that's progress, and it makes me incredibly hopeful that we could in 2021 see a president who actually makes fundamental reform happen.
Are we on a teeter-totter ride in this country? And what I mean by that is, let's just go back to Clinton, and then since Clinton we go Bush, and then we go Obama, and then we go to this total extreme. Somebody who's had he's like a reality TV star basically in the White House, and he's runs his mouth. He's completely opposite of what you'd expect in a well-groomed, well-spoken Obama, for instance. And then we've got Trump. It seems to me like it's a bit of a soap opera. It seems to me the coffers that are driving this DC machine, perhaps almost like a Fox versus an MSC, are doing it to basically feed the American people what like easy bait, something easy to chew on. Is that what's happening? Does that somehow reflect the corruption that you allude to in DC?
I think actually DC has just lost control of the dynamic. The most interesting data from 2016 that I know of is the New Hampshire primary. In New Hampshire, they have a system where you can register as undeclared, and then on the election day, you get to declare whether you want to vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. The majority of people in New Hampshire are undeclared. And when they were polling them about who the undeclared people were going to vote for, the number one choice that they were trying to struggle with is whether they would vote for Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. Now, from Washington's perspective, that's just incomprehensible. How could you be undecided between Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump? That's like night and day. But from the reform perspective, this is completely understandable because Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both framed themselves as outsiders who were going to shake up and change the system. Now, it's kind of surprising. Bernie had been in Washington since 1990, so it's not like he was a real outsider, but he certainly played like an outsider, and that was what Donald Trump did as well. So the point is, the people were so passionately driven by the idea that we needed an outsider to fix this broken, corrupted government, and the insiders just don't get it. And so I think that that's still true today, and I think that's why you're seeing this reform message take off even among people who are genuine insiders in Washington, but especially among the outsiders. And I think that it could be a real opportunity to divide some of the Donald Trump support. Because, if you were somebody who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 because you thought he was going to drain the swamp, let me tell you, that swamp is not drained. It is filled. It is filled with swamp monsters. The lobbyists' control over what happens in Washington today is 1,000 times worse than it was just 4 years ago. So if you care about swamp monsters, it's not Donald Trump who's going to get rid of them. So maybe you should start thinking about a Democrat. Now, many of these people are like, I don't care about the policies of the Democrats or the policies of the Republicans. I just want to end the corruption.
Right.
And those people need to start thinking about whether Donald Trump is going to do it. And so far, the evidence is there's no reason that he would.
Yeah, and as much as the teeter-totter comment comes into play in regards to what I'm saying, it seems like foreign policy stays the same throughout. I mean, there's little twerks and twinks, but for the most part, it's like there's still troops in Iraq, there's still troops in Afghanistan, and that sort of thing. Tell us a little bit about your time clerking for Justice Antonin Scalia. What did you take away from your time with Justice Scalia?
Well, I clerked for Scalia early in his career. Not, he went to the court in, I think, 86, and I clerked for him in 1990 to 91. So he was young on the court, and he was still trying to figure a bunch of stuff out. And what was most impressive to me about him was that, he had announced himself as an originalist, which means somebody who would be bound by the original understanding or the original meaning of the Constitution. But he was also a conservative, and sometimes the conservative instincts are inconsistent with the originalist instincts. The most clearest example of that is with criminal rights. Like, the conservative typically is pro-police, but the framers of our Constitution were not pro-police. They were very, very strongly supportive of the rights of the accused and the rights of innocent people to be protected from the state. So in those conflicts, what was so important to me was that Scalia, when torn between his conservative instincts and his originalist principles, would always tilt in favor of the originalist principles. Now, I don't think that was true throughout his career. I think as he got older on the court, he began to be a little bit more confident in his conservative views. But at that stage, what was striking to me was seeing this person, this, essentially unremovable person, being restricted by self-imposed principles that he thought were the principles that expressed his job. And that was an impressive idea.
Yeah. Where was it, Lawrence, in your career, in your study of corruption? What was it for you that said, "Hey, wait a second, America is compromised, and I've got to do it. Was it Newt Gingrich? What was it that got you saying, "I'm going to take action. I'm going to stand up. And I'm going to try to make a difference"?
Well, this is a story I've told, but it is the story. So I had a friend. His name's Aaron Swartz. Was one incredible genius, one of the original, at the age of 13, he helped create the RSS protocol, which, people use to distribute stuff on the web. And he was one of the founders of Reddit. He was the chief architect of Creative Commons. So he was this genius technician at a very young age who then became a really powerful political social activist. And in 2006, he came to me. I was spending the year in Berlin, and I was really excited about the work I was doing. I was about to give my first TED Talk about copyright issues, and I was finishing what would turn out to be my last book on copyright issues, a book called Remix. And I was telling him all about this, and he was really deeply unimpressed. And he said to me, "So, why do you think you're ever going to make any progress on these questions of internet policy or copyright so long as we have this deeply corrupted Congress?" And I said to him, a little bit miffed, he wasn't excited about my work. I said to him, "So Aaron, it's not my field." And he said, "You mean as an academic?" I said, "Yeah, as an academic, it's not my field. I do copyright policy and internet policy." And he said, "Well, what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen?" And I realized at that moment he had me. I had tenure. I had no excuse not to work on this or anything else. And I thought he was right. There was no chance of actually making real progress on copyright policy or internet policy or any other policy, climate change policy or healthcare policy or minimum wage or you name it, until we fix this corrupted political system. So I agreed with him that night. I was going to give it up. And he and I started the first organization that I began here. It was an organization called Change Congress. It became Root Strikers, and worked together to try to build this movement for reform until in 2013, he was charged by the government with downloading too many academic articles from JSTOR and facing criminal conviction. He committed suicide. So that extreme prosecution led him to take his life, and we lost an extraordinary amount because of that. I lost a friend, but his taking his life in some sense recommitted me to the cause that he started me on, and I'm not going to give up until we succeed in doing what he said we had to do.
Fantastic. Lawrence, as in winding down here, one final question for you. I think listeners can take away perhaps the most alarming issue facing the nation in regards to politics is maybe attempting to do what Trump said he would do in draining that swamp and cleaning up the corruption. But in winding down, the final question I have for you, Lawrence, is, given the United States Constitution, would you change anything about it? Would you make an amendment to it today in 2020? And if you would, what would be the first thing that you would change about it?
I would amend the Constitution to guarantee that we are all equal as citizens, which means you can't play the games of gerrymandering. You've got to fund campaigns so the rich people don't have 1,000 times more influence than the poor people. You can't make it harder for some people to vote because of their political party. You can't have an electoral college that basically allows a few states to decide who the president of the United States will be. I would require everybody have an equal freedom to vote and the right to vote. And if you did that and you built that into the Constitution, you begin to give lawyers a way to enforce equality when the politicians are not eager to give it to us. I think that would be the most important change we could make.
Beautiful. And do you voice your support to anybody running in this upcoming election?
Not yet. I mean, I'm eager to get them all to commit to fundamental reform, which we've seen more and more of them do. I was on the stage with Bernie Sanders 10 days ago, and he committed to fundamental reform. That was incredibly important. But my job is to try to get all of them to, and then I'll vote for the one that excites me beyond that.
And Larry, what's next for you? What can listeners expect coming down the pipe from you?
Well, on Friday, the Supreme Court will decide whether some of our cases challenging the Electoral College will go to the Supreme Court. But, I think the best thing to do is just go to equalcitizens.us and follow us, and you can see a bunch of litigation trying to get reform. You can see a bunch of efforts to get candidates to commit to reform. You can join our podcast. We have our own podcast at equalcitizens.us/anotherway, and join the movement.
Wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, Lawrence Lessig. Larry, thanks for joining the program. We look forward to inviting you back on.
Thank you for having me.
You've tuned into Winwood Radio. This is your weekly host. I come at you Wednesdays, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard. Ian Hamilton Trottier. Follow Larry, get one of his books, look at what he's doing. I always try to urge listeners to, frankly, not take sides politically. That's where my position of comfort is. I have my own opinions about the political system, and it is certainly that it's incredibly corrupt. So I stand back and don't take sides politically. I was asked the other day, how would you vote? I would vote independent. Larry's one of the brilliant minds, in my viewpoint, that is aggressively trying to change this system. And like former guest on the program, Cynthia McKinney, has also been involved very closely with Bernie Sanders. Bernie, to me, seems like a stalwart in that effort. Again, to see that all voices are heard across the country. But there's a lot to be done, and hopefully Larry can continue to make some headway. This is January 8th, another edition of Discussion to Truth. I appreciate and thank you for listening, tuning in, share the podcast. Look for Freedom Reserved. No More Lies, coming at you by Trine Day Publishers, April 2020. And until next week, be awesome.